Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Again, welcome. This is the second lesson in B5. My name is Mr. Kanwar. I'll be taking you through B5, the whole topic. So this is B5 lesson 2. So the first lesson was on central nervous system, which was for all students, combined or triple, foundation tier or higher tier. This lesson is the brain. It is only for triple students. So combined students don't need to be on this video. You need to skip to lesson 4, okay, because lesson 3 is the I. So title in your books or on a sheet of paper is the brain, B5 lesson 2. And remember that B5 is paper 2 and it is homeostasis and response. So that's what we're going to be doing. You just need a pen and paper with you and then we shall get going. So let's start off with the brain. So today's starter, what I'd like us to think about is, what does your brain do? What is your brain made from? So you're like, that's quite a difficult question. Like, what do you think the brain is made from? We know, for example, the heart is a muscular tissue, so it's made from muscle. But what is your brain made from? Interesting. You probably never really thought about this. But even so, it's one good thing to think about. Make a list of things which your body does, which are controlled by your brain. So that's looking at that's looking at what does your brain do, but just give us a list in terms of what you think the brain can do. What I'll do is I'll give you 1 minute. There we go, to think about that. And if you jot down your answers whilst that minute is on. Okay, so time is up. So what does your brain do? So your brain does every conscious decision that you have, but actually it's in control of both conscious and unconscious decisions that you make. So basically everything that you do is controlled by the brain. Apart from generally automatic reflex responses, everything else is pretty much controlled by the brain. What is your brain made from? Well, it's made from white matter and grey matter, which is a type of soft tissue. So it's a group of cells. Okay, and those cells are mainly nerve cells and some non-neural cells because they maintain the health of the brain with also blood vessels. So that's what the brain is made out of. Grey and white matter. Make a list of things which your body does, which are controlled by the brain. Well, that could be lots of things, basically, from movement, language, speech, sight, your reaction, your heartbeat, your hormonal growth, everything pretty much. Your emotions, your brain can control depending on the levels of hormones that are released. So everything in terms of what your body does, that is controlled by the brain. And we're going to talk about the brain, and we'll talk about various parts of the brain. This is actually not a bad section for you triple students because it's fairly straightforward. There's only a little bit of key knowledge we need to know for this topic. Okay. So today's learning outcomes that we've got, our challenge is to recall the different parts of the brain and describe the roles they play. So that's just being able to make sure that we're able to label it and then tell me the functions of the brain. So there are the two things that we want to do with that. Our Aspire, explain how brain mapping could be used in identifying brain disorders. So as we will find out, the brain does various things. Okay, and because the brain does various things, if, for example, it is damaged in any part, then that could lead to a brain disorder. Now, we've got the technology, and some of you may have seen the news and so forth. We've got the technology to map the brain, work out where the damage is, and then identify the certain brain disorder. We're also able to a certain extent, not fix the problem, but at least alleviate the problem, to help the problem. Remember, this is triple only. The challenge aspect are questions that they generally will ask quite a lot, in terms of just being able to label parts of the brain, so that's the recall, and then tell me what those parts do. That's what we're going to do first, so let's move on to that. So this is what a real brain looks like. Okay, that's a real human brain. They're quite large, actually. The human brain is large because we're intelligent, and I don't mean that we're clever, therefore. It means that the fact that we are highly developed, sophisticated, and we adapt to our environments. We can manipulate tools. We can talk, and language. We have language ability. That over time, over a long period of time, evolutionary time, so many millions of years, our brain has got larger and larger and larger. And the reason why it's got larger is because our capacity to think and to make conscious decisions has increased. Therefore, we are described as intelligent beings. Now, that's us as a human race. Doesn't mean that we don't individually, we might not do intelligent things, but even so, we are known as intelligent beings. So that's what a real brain looks like. And there are three main parts you need to know. The first one is the cerebral cortex, sometimes known as the cerebrum, which is what I'll call it from now. And that's a large part. That's basically most of your brain. So what you've got is, and I'll kind of half colour it in for you. So all this section, okay, all that is basically the cerebrum. Okay, and I'll explain what they all do in a second, but let's just go through the labeling of it. So that's your cerebrum. So it's the kind of top bit that you've got. Then you've got this little bit, which is behind this being your spinal cord, by the way. So this bit is the spinal cord. This bit here is, oh, my labels have gone wrong, is the cerebellum. Okay, so this part that I will draw, I'll colour in green here, is the cerebellum. It's generally on the back or the front. It depends on which way you're looking at it, to be fair, but it normally sits just below the cerebral cortex. And then you've got the medulla, and the medulla is just this little part here. Okay, sometimes its technical name is the medulla oblongata, but it's known as the brain stem. So that's where the brain stem part of the spinal cord start. So what you've got the cerebral cortex, which is in red. You've got the cerebellum, which is in green, and you've got the medulla, which is in purple. Let's find out what they do. So you can put subtitle, functions of the brain. If you've not managed to get a diagram of the brain, it doesn't really matter, because I'm sure those three aspects, and we'll come to those again, you'll be able to label. If you want to get a diagram, just grab one off your teacher. So functions of the brain, the cerebrum. So that's the outer layer, the kind of top part, so to say, and it's called the cerebral cortex. It's split into two hemispheres and is highly folded. So basically, it's like, say if you've got a long string of spaghetti, okay, you've got a long string of spaghetti, pasta, for example, and then you kind of squeeze that pasta, it kind of makes like a wave shape. If you kind of squeeze the shape, so it makes like a wave shape, and it's kind of folded, it becomes folded. That's basically how we're describing it. So it's massively long, the brain, or massively big, but what they do, or what the brain, or how your body's developed, I shouldn't say what they do, because we don't do it, but how it's evolved, it's that it's increased its surface area, so its ability to think, because it's highly folded. And what does it do? It controls your intelligence, your personality, your thought, your conscious thought, and high-level functions such as language and verbal memory. Okay, so if you want to get those down, that's what it does. That's what the cerebrum does. The second part, the cerebellum, which was smaller, that controls your balance, your coordination of movement, and your muscular activity. Okay, so you got your cerebrum. You've got to be careful with these two words because they look very similar. So you've got cerebrum and cerebellum. They do look fairly similar, but you've got to make sure that you're able to spell these correctly. Okay, so the cerebellum, it controls the balance, the coordination of movement, and the muscular activity. And then the final one, the medulla, that controls unconscious activities such as heart rate and breathing rate. Okay, so that's really important. It controls the unconscious part of your body. I'll give you 30 seconds to get that down if you've not got it down. Again, if 30 seconds is not enough, that's not a problem. Just pause the video here and then you can just get those parts down. So the cerebrum, intelligence, personality, conscious thought, memory and language. Cerebellum, balance, coordination, movement. Medulla, unconscious activities such as heart rate and breathing. Because you don't really know that you're doing it half the time. Okay, so like I said, if you've not had a chance to do it, just pause the video and just get that information down. So what I want you to do, really quick activity, I want you to label the brain diagram with names and functions of the different areas of the brain. Now, normally you would have the brain in front of you. If you don't have the brain in front of you, that's absolutely fine. What I'd like you to do is, and that's why they're color coded, you've got yellow, green, and purple. What I want you to do is just write down yellow, green, and purple, or quickly draw that brain. I mean, it doesn't have to be technically an artistic impression. Just draw the brain as you see it, and then label it, and then just quickly write me a function of it. I'm not going to give you long. I'll give you a minute. So you've got 1 minute, and all I want is you to label them. So you could just call it yellow, green, and purple. And then what I'd also like you to do is just quickly jot down one thing that each one does. Okay, so we've got yellow, green, and purple. Let's start off with purple, because that's always generally the easiest one. Purple, the small bit, just at the back. What we've got is the medulla. So purple is the medulla. So what I'll do is just on here, I will put M, and that is your medulla. Now, if you can remember what the medulla does, hopefully you got down, it controls breathing and heart rate, or your unconscious part of the body. Okay, so that is the medulla. Then we go to the green bit here, middle, and that is the cerebellum. Okay, I'm just going to circle that word at the bottom. So let me draw my arrow. There we go. So that is the cerebellum, that bit there. And what does that do? Well, that controls, if you remember, your coordination, your muscular activity, and your balance. So it's kind of like you as a person movement. So that's what that controls. And then the final bit, known as the cerebrum, or in this case, the cerebral cortex, I'll use the keyword at the bottom, that is the yellow. Hopefully you can see that. Oops, trying to colour in that arrow. That is the cerebral cortex. Now that controls everything else pretty much. So your kind of growth, your language, your personality, that kind of thing. So that's what the cerebral cortex involves. Hopefully you managed to already be able to label them. If you can't, you need to practice to make sure that you can do. So cerebrum, cerebellum green, and medulla. And then in terms of what knowledge, if you think about personality at the top, exercise in the middle, so controlling everything, and then breathing and heart rate at the bottom in terms of the medulla. So that's our labeling. That's our challenge aspect, okay? So we're recalling the different parts of the brain and describing the roles that they play. What I want us to think about now is I want you to imagine that you're a neurosurgeon. And then if you saw one of these symptoms, where would their brain be damaged? So think about it. Think about how we've learned about the functions. Okay, so we've learned about the functions, about what each part of the brain does. Now what I want you to do is to relate one of those parts to one of these brain disorders. So we've got kept falling unconscious, can't remember what he did yesterday, or can't remember what they did yesterday, keeps falling over, has forgotten to speak English, and irregular heartbeat. Okay, so you've got 5 points. All I want you to do next to them is tell me whether it's medulla, whether it's cerebrum, or whether it's cerebellum. There are 5. I'll give you a minute. It shouldn't take any time longer than that. You could write down kept falling unconscious and then put your answer there. Okay, so 1 minute. Okay, so let us see what our answers are. Okay, so let's see what answers we have come up with. And don't worry if you've got them wrong. It's just to see whether we're thinking about what part of the brains, which part of the brains does what, and how they relate to certain disorders. So kept falling unconscious. It's actually the medulla, and this one's probably the hardest one. The reason why it's the medulla, because if you remember what the medulla does, it controls breathing rate and heart rate. If you fall unconscious, you generally have a drop in blood pressure, or your heart rate decreases, or your breathing rate decreases. So that is why it's the medulla. Okay, so it's not about your brain capacity. This is just you falling unconscious, and generally you will fall. So it's fainting basically. So if you faint, then the reason why you faint is it might be related to your medulla and how it controls your breathing and your heart rate. Can't remember what you did yesterday, or he did yesterday, is the cerebrum, because that is all to do with memory. Okay, so that's the cerebrum. Number 3, keeps falling over, cerebellum, because cerebellum, remember, is related to your control, your balance, and your coordination. So that's the cerebellum. Forgotten to speak English, cerebrum, language. It's a higher level thought. Okay, so it's higher level function, I should say. So remember that language and speech. So sometimes you do get that. You know, some people have an accident, they get hit on the head, and all of a sudden they can't speak that language. They may have been able to speak some other language, and all of a sudden they can only speak that language, and you forget how to speak the other one. That is why, if you cycle or if you are on the road, you must make sure that you wear helmets, because any sort of damage to the brain can lead to significant disorders. And the 5th one, irregular heartbeat, very similar to the first one in the fact that you're feeling faint, but this one's to do with heartbeat. It's the medulla again. So hopefully you managed to get, no, you don't need to have got 5 out of 5. It was just if you haven't got those right, then just jot those down in terms of which one is which. Pause the video if you need to. to get those answers. One of the things that you would notice is the cerebral cortex is huge. Yeah, it makes up the large part of the brain. And we also know that it has lots of different roles. We've mentioned personality, we've mentioned language, mentioned speech, conscious part. So it seems to be involved growth. It controls a lot, it seems, the cerebral cortex. Here's a question for you. How could we find out what each part did? How did we find that out? Which part of the brain did what, for us to then map out brain disorders, essentially. Well, we start off with this guy called Phineas Gage. And he's interesting because what happened is he was a railway worker and he was working on an iron railway, and unfortunately for him, he got a spike through his head. He doesn't, he looks quite smart there, but he got a spike through his head. And you can see the image on the right hand side, the skeleton. The spike destroyed a large part of the brain called the frontal lobe. So, the front part of your brain where your forehead is, you can see that it's labeled blue on this diagram here. Okay, and then you can see that's the damage. Obviously, he's, he doesn't look like he's functioning very well at the moment. Interestingly, he did survive. So even with that going through his head, he managed to survive. But his personality was really, really different. Now, because his personality was really, really different, the doctors who dealt with him thought, well, actually, it must be some sort of damage to his brain, or that part of the brain must be related to personality. And it's quite interesting when you read about his story. So if you get a chance, do Google him because it's quite interesting. So we worked out that the frontal lobe of the brain is important for personality. And it was simply because of that accident to Phineas Gage. And because of that accident and that railway spike, we found out that personality was there with the frontal lobe. Now, we've got lots of different parts of the brain. Interestingly, what we need to understand is that by knowing what each part of the brain does, which is known as brain mapping, this could be done by effectively damaging those parts of the brain. Now, that sounds quite strange. So what you would do, so let me say that again, what you would do is if you needed to work out what that part of the brain does, you actually need to damage it in the first place. And if you damage it in the first place, then you can work out, whether it's personality, whether it's language, whether it's something else. What's the problem with this? Well, I think it's fairly obvious what the problem is. No one wants their brain to be damaged. However, unless that happens, we do not know which part of the brain does what. So by selectively damaging certain parts of the brain, we are able to do it. Now, there are massively ethical, moral issues about this. Some people are willing to give up their brains for this, but obviously they need to still be alive. There's no point in them being dead. So there are issues carrying out brain surgeries or treating problems with the brain. So even if you did know which part of the brain does what, some of brain surgery, now brain surgery is really difficult because obviously the skull protects the brain. If you crack a part of the skull open to then do some surgery on the brain, you may accidentally damage other parts of the brain that can therefore cause problems. And so that's why brain surgery is seen, or neurosurgery I should say, is seen as one of the most difficult aspects of medicine. And it is something that, can cause a lot of different side effects. Our brain, we've discovered, has various aspects to it. So you've got different lobes. Now, you don't need to know this. You don't need to be able to label it. You need to be just familiar that different parts of the brain has different lobes in this sense, and those lobes control certain aspects of your body. So, for example, the frontal lobe, which is in red, is all to do with smell, speech, concentration, and motor control. Okay, you've got this yellow orange part called the parietal lobe, touch, pressure, and taste, and body awareness. And then you've got this central bit that kind of goes across the temporal lobe, which is your thinking part. And that's all to do with language and reading. And then you've got vision at the back. That's why sometimes if you bang your head, it sometimes goes blurry. You know, and that's because you've effectively just hit that lobe and it causes your vision to get blurry. Now, obviously, most of the time it will fix itself. You've got to remember that the brain is supplied with a lot of blood. That blood will bring, you know, inflammatory cells and cells that are able to fix your body really quickly. It's oxygenated a lot. And that's really, really important. If you don't get enough oxygen to your brain, you effectively kill those cells. If you kill those cells, then that's where you can get brain damage. So a lack of oxygen can cause brain damage. Sometimes that occurs prenatal, so i.e. when you're carrying a baby. Sometimes you can get brain damage because the umbilical cord doesn't carry enough oxygen. Or, for example, by smoking a lot during pregnancy, it can cause, because obviously carbon monoxide replaces the oxygen. Because carbon monoxide replaces the oxygen, it means that the baby doesn't get enough oxygen. Therefore, it is starved of oxygen, and that can damage the body. That can damage and cause brain disorders. So that's why it's so important to follow the advice. You know, when pregnant, you don't smoke. It doesn't happen all the time, and sometimes you know, it won't occur, but you don't want to have that chance. Question for you: what size brain would different animals have? They have different sizes because they have different intelligences, so to say. Yeah, and that doesn't mean that they're not clever. It just means that their ability to, for example, dogs and cats don't necessarily talk. Well, obviously they don't talk. They communicate in a very archaic way, so a very simple way, barking, meowing, and so forth. But it's not language as such. Different meows might mean different things. And, you know, if you've got a dog and a cat, you know by the certain woof, for example, or a meow, that they may be communicating with you excitedly, or they're meowing because they're hurt. That's very simple. However, they don't have the language that we do, which is why our brain is larger. Dolphins have large brains, and as you can see, gorillas do too, and it's very similar, a gorilla one, and obviously an elephant does, and they are large creatures anyway. So you can see that different animals have different sized brains because it depends on how much they have developed. Now, what I'd like us to do is an exam question just to finish this off. So we've gone through different parts of the brain and describing the roles that they play. We've explained to a certain extent brain mapping and then identifying certain brain disorders. Those questions that you'd get are fairly, you know, straightforward in the fact that you'll be given some information and they'll say which part of the brain could be damaged from it. So here's an exam question. Modern humans belong to the species Homo sapiens. Many people think that modern humans evolved from more primitive species. 3 of these primitive species were, now this is going to be hard to say, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus, and you can see those there. These 3 species are now extinct, so we can say goodbye to those. The graph shows the brain size of several specimens from each of the species. So you can see Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and then the first one, Australopithecus. So you can see that those are there, those 3. Question A, estimate the mean brain size of Homo habilis from that graph. So I will give you 30 seconds to work that out. So estimate, and I'll move my timer out of the way, the mean brain size, actually I'll need to move it here, of Homo habilis. Okay, so hopefully you got an answer for that. If you haven't, then just pause it and then just have a look. You don't need to work it out because it says estimate. Okay, so it's not about working each dot out. It's about giving an estimate. An estimate, I should say. I'm not sure why I'm saying estimate. Just give it an estimate. So think about, where does it look like it? We'll go through the answers in a second. Okay, part B and part C. So part B, suggest how we know about the brain size of Australopithecus. How do we know that the brain size of those people that lived, 2-3 million years ago was that? And part C, suggesting an explanation in terms of natural selection for the change in brain size during the evolution of Homo sapiens. Okay? 4 minutes I'll give you for this. So just bullet point your answers. Suggest how we know the brain size of Australopithecus, and then that's for 2 marks. And then part C, suggest an explanation in terms of natural selection for the change in brain size during the evolution of Homo sapiens. The clue, and the only clue I'll give you, is that it must be related to this keyword. Okay, if we haven't moved on, we should definitely be on part C. Just 1 minute remaining. Okay, so let's go through some of the answers. So, first mark was about the size, the mean size. So any mark, well, any number I should say, between 550 and 650 was acceptable for 1 mark. Okay, so that was acceptable. Part B, how do we know about the Ostra humans? Well, because we've got skulls. Yeah, because we found skulls. So this goes back to the fossils topic. So because we've got skulls, we were able to work that, well, get that information from there. And also, if you said preserved as fossils, you'd get the second mark, or measure the skull volume, because obviously that's what it's talking about. So basically, if you put fossilized skulls, you would have got 2 marks for that, even though they gave you 3 sentences for some reason. Part C, talking about natural selection, why is it bigger? So you need to talk about that there's variation. Yeah. So there's variation of brain. So there's a range of brain size, or suddenly some of them have got a bigger brain because of mutation. Now the ones with large brains are more likely to survive. Yep, that's second mark. And then their genes are passed on to the next generation, to the offspring inherited. So it's classic natural selection answer. So you start off with a range or variation in a population. So you've got variation in population. The ones with larger brains survive. Because they're more intelligent, you could get that as well. And then they pass on their genes to the next generation. And that is worth 3 marks. Okay, hopefully you managed to get the numbers one. You may have got the skulls, you may have forgotten about the fossils, or measure the skull volume, and hopefully natural selection managed to at least get 4 marks there, and hopefully you managed to get 6. Okay, that is the brain lesson complete. That's lesson 2. Lesson 3 will be on the eye. Again, that is for triple only. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you again, or you won't see me again soon. You'll hear from me again soon. See you later. Goodbye.